Hello, everybody. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Solidarity Live. We are here with Jay Ponti, author of Be the Revolution. Jay, how are you this morning?
I'm doing great.
Oh, I'm so glad we were here. We had some serious technical difficulties just now, so it is
Got my
lovely
got
to
my
see your...
coffee. We're on West Coast time, so
I'm so glad to see your face. Yeah, so despite my chipper mood, it's actually been a very dark and strange week for politics. We have Hurricane Ida ravaging the Gulf Coast, and a dark irony on the 16th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. And abortion is all but illegal in Texas now. So,
big
Jay,
Handmaid's Tale energy.
we need your wisdom. So, for those who don't know, Jay is a longtime organizer and Bernie bro in the best sense of the word, has done work with Poor People's Campaign, and is author of the very exciting upcoming book, Be the Revolution, which we are very excited to be publishing on Strong Arm Press. So I don't even know where to start. I have so much I want to talk to you about. But speaking of anniversaries, the 10-year anniversary of Occupy Wall Street is also, it's what, 2 weeks? Did I get that right?
Yeah, S17, so September 17th.
Okay.
Can't
So
believe it. Oh my God, 10 years.
tell me about that. How are we celebrating?
Well, Occupy organizers in Boston, New York, and LA are creating events. And, we're networking. The Occupy network is still alive. One thing a lot of people don't know, there's this popular mythos that was driven by the corporate news that Occupy failed, which is categorically untrue. The saying like they tried to bury us, but they didn't know that we were seeds. When in truth, actually, the Occupy network continued to organize, never stopped organizing. And one of the subjects the book explores is how Occupy Wall Street directly led to the Bernie Sanders campaign as a strategic and tactical initiative to organize against the third way Democrats represented by the Clinton campaign. But all sorts of other movements came out of that. So a number of us are getting together, especially at this moment for the left. A lot of us feel that this is a really important time, especially organizing in a post-Bernie era. Bernie brought together huge swaths of the left with different ideologies, different points of view, everything from left-leaning liberals all the way to left-leaning libertarians, which is a huge difference in ideologies. And so without that central vision to sort of guide us and strategy of the campaign, now it's really descended into factionalism in a lot of different ways. So we think that this is an important moment to talk about the impact Occupy has had, to remember that moment in history, which I think for many of us was a very big moment of experiencing this huge wave of populist energy and this incredible sense that anything was possible, even in the face of the corporate state. And the book explores a lot of these subjects. But yeah, it's a especially with the IPCC report about that just came out, telling us that we have 8 years to go carbon neutral. I mean, there really is, like, this is a sort of a come to Jesus moment for all of us.
It's a really fascinating and horrifying time, because it's like you're saying, Jay, we had the Bernie Sanders run, which came out of the Occupy movement, and there's supposed to be this, ideally, this unity following that, because we are in a space where we maybe could get some stuff done. We have the political facts are with us, and we also have the political influence now, which I think we take for granted. I mean, it's not difficult for me to remember when a lot of the things which are now mainstream political discussions were so fringy you couldn't even bring them up outside of your friends or coffee shop group or whatever. And now these are in the mainstream media cycle, and you're absolutely correct. How could that be a loss? That's a huge win Whenever I hear the Occupy movement lost, I'm like, okay, did they think we were trying to literally bring down Wall Street? That would be cool, but I don't think that was the point. I mean, am I wrong about that? Was that the point?
I think that's what a lot of people wanted. Yeah, in some ways, yes, but I think that the more important thing that happened was the shift in consciousness. So, one of the premises that this book, especially the original version of this book, shared is the concept of paradigm, the concept of the Overton window, and our consciousness and our unconscious is a driving force on an individual and a collective level. And previously, the idea of the 1% versus the 99% would take the form of, it would be dismissed as class warfare. In my opinion, there is a class war. It is real. 60,000 people die every year because they don't have health care. And yet, in 2016, the idea of Medicare for all was still a fringe idea, which is crazy because it's just normal in every other industrial country. But the psychic shift to the 99% and the 1%, understanding there's a very small group of people that control the government and have hegemony. One term we might call as a term that was put forth by Gramsci is cultural hegemony. So this is how you might call the corporate state occupies the hearts and minds of the populace to keep us sort of complacent. And Occupy was an incredible disruption to that. It showed people that it was okay to disrupt without it. You could protest without a permit, for instance, and we didn't need to ask permission to occupy our public spaces. And I think that was a really important moment for people because the 2008 crisis hit people so hard. It hit everyday Americans, and all of a sudden, like paradigms don't generally change unless there is some kind of traumatic event. Usually, like 9/11 was a big paradigm change. World War II was a big paradigm change in America. And you can even think about this in your own life. Most of us really just kind of do the same thing. We get into our ruts mentally and emotionally, unless there's something like, a divorce, a sickness, a death in the family. So it's true on an individual level or a family level, those things that kind of rock us to our foundation. And the 2008 crisis was definitely that for America. And yet they saw clearly that their government failed them so completely. The banks got bailed out. The banks caused the financial crisis, left millions of people upside down on their mortgages or foreclosed upon or homeless. People who had done everything, they did the thing that society told them to do. They went to school, they got jobs, they bought a house, they got a mortgage, and then all of a sudden they're upside down on their mortgage because of these subprime loans and synthetic CDOs. And then not only did no one go, I think one person went to jail. It was ridiculous. Wasn't even a major player. And then they got bailed out. Like they actually got bailed out, and people saw this happening in real time. And so, yeah, those are some of the themes we talk about in the book. But moreover, this is an important moment because we might be on the verge of another eviction crisis coming out of the pandemic. And yes, so much has changed, but I think the most important thing out of Occupy is the change in consciousness. But then there's been a lot of movements that have come directly out of Occupy. The Fight for 15 was a direct manifestation of Occupy. The campaign and the movement for public banking came directly out of Occupy. And God, what else? Strike debt. So there's been incredible work happening where to the movement to relieve people of debt. So a lot of so again, like we're going to talk about those things, but beyond that, many of us feel it's also an important moment for us to get out of our silos, get out of our own little bubbles, get out of our own little echo chambers, and start thinking about the title of the show, solidarity, intersectionality. it's going to be very difficult for us to change the system itself, to make the systemic changes without solidarity across all of the movements for health justice, racial justice, climate justice, gender justice, reproductive rights justice, you know, and all of these issues are interrelated. So
well, and it's I you know, in the reproductive justice thing, I think, you know, we'd be remiss if we don't talk about Texas. But what you were saying earlier in the pre-show about the Koch brothers, you know, Occupy and the Tea Party are frequently juxtaposed against each other as if they're like these separate but equal movements, but they're totally not. Mm-hmm. Occupy came out of people power and people organizing. The Tea Party is funded by billionaires' interest, and reproductive justice, Roe v. Wade is still a large. Most Americans believe that an abortion is a necessary evil. Now, I'm not saying abortion is evil, but that's how most Americans feel, right? They feel quite strongly that if a woman wants or needs to or whatever, she should have that right. And yet you have these terrifying, wealthy one percenters who realize that this is an issue they can weaponize to create this pseudo movement of people who, you know, oh, well, if you're religious, clearly you're not a baby murderer. So clearly, I mean, what were you saying earlier before we got interrupted by, you know, needing to do the show?
Yeah, and you and I always have I love our talks.
Me too.
Go on forever. And actually, this version of the book did come out of direct conversations with you and Alex. So, you know, the previous version was like 650 pages, and Alex was like, yeah, you might want to think, like, you know, maybe people aren't going to want to read a 650-page book on organizing. That's a manual. I'm like, fair enough.
But they will read 4 100 and something pages.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But in terms of the Koch brothers, and you know, the Tea Party did have populist roots, but it was co-opted very strategically by the Koch brothers. And it's important to note, and one of the things we do talk about in the book is that there's been a very highly strategic, highly organized effort since 1997 by the Koch brothers to, one, destroy objective science, and 2, take over state legislatures, right? So there's a network of about 14 dark money think tanks who are well funded by fossil fuel money, and you know, like there's a cabal. You know, that term itself from QAnon's been sort of become a buzzword, but there is a literal junta called ALEC, and then also this network of 14 plus dark money groups like the Heritage Foundation, groups like Donors Trust. Donors Trust was literally the organization that drove the tactics and funded Big Tobacco's war against objective science and junk science, trying to uplift the tobacco industry, which is it's absurd. You know, the idea, just like, you know, the trope now on the right, which has become mainstream on the right, that climate change is a hoax. Like Trump said, climate change is a hoax created by the Chinese. It's insane. It's the same. These are literally the same people, Donors Trust, who drove the false narrative. And there is a playbook. They actually have a playbook, and you can actually see a through line with the takeover of these state legislatures, like Texas, and something like 22 state legislatures have been taken over by Republicans. And you can see the through line to this very small group of people who are highly strategic, and it actually goes all the way. You can run a through line all the way to QAnon, and it's really the destruction of the fabric of our society, and this is the fallout. Part of that is because the Democrats' posture on issues. They don't the corporate Democrats, the party bosses, they don't really care about the issues. You know, these are wedge issues that they use to that they use to sort of fire up the base. But at least they have the right narrative on a lot of these issues, right? Even if they pass different policies on a policy measure. The Republicans, however, are just basically a death cult. They're literal death cult right now. It's sort of a dystopian Handmaid's Tale. That, and one of the reasons is because they've never stood for anything. Because they don't stand for anything, there is no actual policy that benefits working people. They have to target fringe groups like the fundamentalist Christians, the NRA. And actually, the last chapter in the book explores how QAnon itself was a highly organized psyop that was driven by some of these same bad actors. And again, they're looking to mobilize, mobilize the crazy and convert that into political power. And now we're seeing the effects of that with some of the terrible legislation. And there's terrible legislation at a state level all over the place, in a lot of different like Florida is criminalizing protest itself, literally criminalizing protest. There's a bill on the books in Florida that makes it legal for somebody to plow into protesters with their car. That's insane. Like literally
terrifying.
Yeah.
I love that you're laying it out so clearly, because I think it can be overwhelming for people. This is why you're an author, because you lay out the things clearly. It's
God,
like,
it's so weird to say that I'm an author. Like I still haven't wrapped my head around that.
This will be up for pre-order soon, gentlemen and ladies and all genders. So it's gonna be great. But I think what you're saying is really important for people to get. Whenever I hear that America has become hyper partisan, I kind of bridle at that a little bit, because it's like you're saying, Jay, it's not the case that if you interview your average American that they're pro plowing into protesters, nor are they pro like preventing women who need or want one from getting the abortion care they need. Like, most people are actually pretty progressive on these issues. And that's why it is in a very dark way, a fascinating phenomenon that we're witnessing, because America is actually pretty progressive. Very few people think that people should be declaring medical bankruptcy. Very few people think that Black Lives Matter is a controversial statement, to such an extent that last summer, when we had these protests, like millions of people were out in the street. And yet our legislation and our legislators are becoming more and more reactionary every day. It's a terrifying thing. And I mean, we owe so much to movements like Occupy. I mean, what was it like being there? Like, what do you remember? Like, how did you get involved? Did you know? Because I know your background. You were a rock star. I don't know. What's your music?
I mean, I played my background is I played in bands, and that's how I started organizing. I started organizing on a community level in my hometown in Northampton. After 9/11, like I just had to do something with that energy. I didn't know what to do. So I organized a 9/11 benefit. And then, interestingly enough, like a corporation had taken over our local venues. We had this great music scene where, Dinosaur Jr., the Pixies, a lot of great seminal indie bands came out of that town. We were going to be the next Seattle. And then a corporation bought our music venues and sort of stifled the music scene. So we started our own, and we realized that we took over a few like DIY venues, sort of punk rock venues. And we realized that when we had all the bands work together, if you have 15 fans and I have 15 fans, if you play together and you work together, you have 30 fans, and it's way more fun. And that's pretty much what I've been doing since. But really, like, Occupy was a life-changing moment for me. Let me just say, like, getting hit with a baton has a way of shifting your worldview left. Like there's like a sharp moment where like I got hit with the end of a baton in the back of the ribs, where I went, oh my God. And I just remember that moment when about 1,000 riot police came out when they took down the encampment, which, by the way, highly coordinated, highly organized, highly coordinated, highly organized. Mayors around the country were having conference calls with sheriffs around the country to strategize together. And to me, these are things that we and the left need to start thinking about doing. And that is actually happening more and more. Occupy was a moment that did, because of the internet, allow us to come together more and more, which did then, I think, create the sort of the infrastructure in a way, even if it's very decentralized, that these networks came together through the internet, which allowed for, mobilizations around Bernie Sanders, Standing Rock, Ferguson. A lot of these came out of that. But it was incredible. I mean, it was like a punk rock festival circus. And the occupation in LA, I didn't get to Zuccotti, but LA was it was magnificent. And one of my big takeaways from that was, just imagine if someone came to you and said, hey, I got this idea. Let's get 1,000 people and let's create a siege of City Hall and live on the grounds, live on the lawn in tents for 3 months. You would think that you'd be like, you have lost your mind. And yet that happened. And I think that's one of the things that we forget. And that was also like the Arab Spring had much darker origins with the Syrian civil war, and it had much darker origins. But that literally these things started with a Facebook page. The Women's March started with a Facebook page. So like and that's another one of the subjects we explore, is that a handful of committed citizens, just 5 people with no resources, can literally change the world. And that's something we forget. But for me, just being in that energy, that's something that I don't think we could possibly put into words, the energy of the occupation. And it very much was an experiment. It was a place where there were trainings, people talked about ideas in these working groups, and people like me who, I probably would say I probably skewed more liberal than anything, definitely had my paradigm change dramatically, especially in the Obama era. Like, seeing the after Occupy, the lenses that we look through like changed dramatically. And I think the last piece of this that comes to mind right now is just one of the lessons that we did learn, many of us learned in Occupy, was that without an inside and outside strategy, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to actually change the system, because the system is codified by laws. Our ability to govern ourselves is in a lot of ways determined by the laws. Like, now women's right to govern their own bodies is now completely a threat in Texas because of a law. It's because they built political power. And I think that's one of the takeaways a lot of us had is, it's like, we absolutely should continue to mobilize. It makes a difference. It is important to bring together. It is important to have these giant uprisings. And as a theory of change, it is very important also that in a strategic way, organizers are able to leverage that people power of the whirlwind to fight for policy change. And a lot of the really important changes, like the Voting Act, this is how slick and Martin Luther King passed the Voting Act, for instance. It was because they had the power of disruption, the power of mass mobilization, also using that as a tactic and a strategy to negotiate with LBJ. So that's one of the ways that and without that disruption, the power of that disruption, LBJ wouldn't have taken such a stand on it, because he was a Southern racist Democrat. So.
I mean, I love that you bring up LBJ, because if anybody doubts that activism can not just work, but have historic, generational impacts, please read anything about Lyndon B. Johnson, because exactly, Jay, he wasn't just like, I'm not so sure about civil rights. No, he was like an all and out, Dixiecrat racist that was transformed into the president who not just passed the Voting Rights Act, but was its champion. And like, obviously that's not usually how it happens, but like, yeah. And I mean, oh my God, I have so many questions for you based on all of that. But one of the things that you've alluded to is that in both, you know, when we talk and in your writing, is the way that we do need to have like an updated theory of organizing, that like a lot of the things have worked in the past might not work now. Do you mind saying more about that?
Yeah, I think this is a tough conversation. You know, the word paradigm is almost synonymous with comfort zone. And as humans, it's just a natural human tendency for us to do, you know, we're creatures of habit. And, you know, so these movements, social movements, are seeking to change paradigms. You know, like, what does that mean? That is the aggregate sum of our collective beliefs, right? These are very difficult to shift. You know, it is our worldview. It is the way we see the world, literally see the world. It happens on a neurophysiological level. And that's almost synonymous with our comfort zone. And there are comfort zones on the left as well. Like, a lot of our tactics, a lot of our theory of change is stuck in the 60s or 70s. Meanwhile, you had people like Steve Bannon and the Mercers on behalf of the Trump neo-fascists using psychographics and Cambridge Analytica to literally rewrite the rule book for politics using digital tactics that have never been used before. They have 5,000 data points on every person, and they were actually they were able to weaponize that to mobilize people for Trump. And so the neo-fascist right is changing. It's like, I don't know if you've seen that movie Moneyball. I don't know if you've seen Moneyball, where they use math. They sort of use math to you know, to change the game of baseball. It's almost, they did the same thing. And meanwhile, our tactics in the progressive left haven't really changed much since the 70s. And I think this is a tough conversation we also need to have with respect to Bernie 2020 and Bernie 2016. There was a notion that if we just knock on enough doors and call, you know, phone bank enough, we're going to win. And yes, we came very close to that. We did come very, very, very close. And it was only because of a highly organized, highly strategic, highly organized, highly strategic group of corporate Democrats, the Never Bernie crowd. You have the Neera Tandons, Pete Buttigieg, and the wealthy Democratic donors were literally meeting in you know, wealthy fundraisers across the country, going like, oh my God, how are we going to stop this populist Bernie movement, right? And that's another thing that's important, is to separate the campaign from the movement. Same thing with Occupy, separating the tactic of occupation from the Occupy movement, which is a global movement. But again, like, looking at this highly strategic, and if they hadn't been so well organized, we came very, it's the closest the left has ever, the real left has ever come to real power. But we do need to, I think, also have a moment. We still haven't done a real autopsy on that. And I think we have to ask some hard questions. How can we, you know, sort of use, how do we explore and leverage the most cutting edge digital tactics with our field tactics? Because we have the people power, we have the numbers, we are right, we are on the right side of history, we have the energy, we have the momentum in a lot of ways, and at the same time, still, you know, we have not yet fully converted that into political power, which again is something that I think a lot of us occupiers, especially the initiative called the People for Bernie Sanders, which is an entire chapter in the book, The People for Bernie, that was sort of a core principle that they explored in their theory of change.
Well, and I mean, you know, again, everybody, the book will be available for pre-order soon. If you go, keep your eye on the Strong Arm Press website. But yes, I am very, like, I, you know, we've talked about this a number of times. It's something that we on the left, broadly speaking, have to really address, that what drives people to progressive politics and what drives people to right-wing politics are frequently very different. And on the left, we have a lot of people who are seeking catharsis. They're seeking emotional catharsis for some kind of wound. Like, you know, an example in my life is like I covered the Me Too movement very closely. And, you know, for all women, that was an incredibly emotional moment. And that's beautiful and important. And I would never want to take that away from any part of progressive organizing. And also, at the same time, the things that are controlling it, a group dynamic when we're in a state of catharsis, are not necessarily the things that lead us to win. Especially because, and I knew we needed to talk about this on this show, it's like you have said, Jay, the left looks for traitors, the right looks for converts. Yeah. And if you are in a state of woundedness, as real and valid and even powerful as that may be, you're not necessarily in a place of strategic, like, okay, what are they doing well that we can learn from? Okay, how can we bring more people onto our side? Now, obviously, you know, I hate this. It's not my job to educate you. Like, yes, of course, if somebody is a right-wing fascist, white supremacist Nazi, yeah, like whatever. Like, these are not people we need to be speaking to. But most people are not that. Most people actually do need to be educated. And most people did not come out of the womb as socialist organizers. So I mean, I'll let you speak on this because you speak on this very eloquently.
Well, it's a difficult subject. It's a highly nuanced subject. And I do think the subject of addressing our trauma is really important. Those of us who are fighting for justice, most of the time, it is impossible to live in America and not be traumatized. You know, it is a violent culture. We are living in a violent culture on every levels. And as intersectionality teaches us, you know, the more marginalized factors an individual has, you know, women, people of color, queer, you know, trans, like it actually, the more disadvantages you have and the more that trauma is going to affect us, meaning it is impossible, you know, not impossible, but it is like the number of hurdles you have to jump over just to survive and then to thrive are much greater. Also, those of us who are involved in organizing, it is absolutely traumatic. You know, being in Standing Rock is absolutely traumatic. You know, seeing that our friends had their eyes shut out with a concussion grenade point blank. Sophia Wilansky had her arm blown up, literally. Susie was shot with a tear gas canister. Sophia Wilansky was hit with a concussion grenade. Also, that happened in Occupy Wall Street to a veteran in Zuccotti Park. And it is absolutely traumatic experience. When we don't deal with trauma, it cannot think clearly because our brain isn't functioning properly. And that leads us to all sorts of problems with actually just having a functional organizing, a functional affinity group. And we, you know, you mentioned that aphorism, the right looks for converts, the left looks for traitors, right? That part of that, I believe part of that paradigm is born out of years of infiltration. The Occupy movement was infiltrated. It was infiltrated. Standing Rock was infiltrated. Black Lives Matter has been infiltrated by agents of the corporate state. When I say the corporate state, I mean industry and government and the police state working together in a highly strategic and coordinated way to dismantle these movements. But what ends up happening is a couple things. One, we look for traitors where the right looks for converts, right? So instead of getting outside of our own echo chambers, and we end up talking in the way that we talk, and not everybody thinks the way we have thought. And so what ends up happening is we end up alienating a lot of people, because I do believe the left is right about the issues. But the problem is that a lot of it is still rooted, a lot of our conversation is still rooted in the paradigm of retributive justice instead of transformative justice. And retributive justice comes out of an age-old paradigm born out of this sort of like Old Testament idea of women being evil because, you know, Eve ate the apple or whatever the shit, you know, like that. But it comes out of that. That's like, these are the stories that are in the drinking water of our culture. And now you're still seeing that manifest in policy. You're seeing that manifest in Texas. You're seeing that manifest in the school to prison pipeline. But we are not immune to that on the left. So a lot of, you know, the retributive justice means that if I see something and I think it's wrong, I immediately think it's my job to punish. I judge and punish, judge and punish, judge and punish, instead of asking questions. You know, and we make bad assumptions. I'll tell you the truth. I am terrified. I'm authentically terrified to put this book out. I wrote this book because I didn't know how to have these conversations in organizing spaces. So I wrote a book. I wrote a book to talk about it, to try to change the conversation. But I'm authentically terrified because, you know, I honestly think that there's a danger. People are going to say that, oh, you're using the movement to make money. You're selling out. You're moving. Like, I'm honestly, it's an honest concern of mine because I care so deeply about these things. But it is very much so. How can we go about the work of justice when the paradigm and the worldview we're operating out of is the same paradigm that leads to the school to prison pipeline, that actually is the opposite of justice, right? So in my opinion, we need to take care of ourselves, and we need to change the way we approach talking and looking at justice, in my opinion.
I love every single word you just said. I hate that we only have 10 minutes because I want to, because first of all, if anyone ever says that to you, I just want to go on record. No one makes money writing, but well, I hope you make tons of money. But like, I have never met someone who is writing a book to make money because, you know, Jay, you are a stellar example of somebody who wants to provide this as a gift for the world because we need it. And it, like, we desperately need resources. So I'm an avid reader, which is why Alex recruited me for Strong Arm. And it's like, it's sad. You go to Amazon, there aren't really books for progressives. You end up having to read like books by, you know, corporate journalists, which like,
okay, I'm going to go to my well curated, you know, this is an accident. Okay, let's get real.
I love it. It's my favorite background ever.
This is not an accident. Okay, let's get honest. But there are some fucking awesome books on organizing. Like this is an awesome book by Paul Engler. You know, talks about the tension between structure-based organizing and mass mobilization. Super important concept. I think something we didn't get right in the Poor People's Campaign. Right? If you don't fundamentally understand Ella Baker style structure-based organizing, and you don't understand the difference between that and what a mass mobilization is, you're going to make mistakes in your theory of change, which is not going to produce the effect that you want. That is an amazing one. What's another one? Direct
Twitter
action.
And tear gas we talk about on the show quite frequently.
Gas, awesome.
Very
one.
good.
There's another one up here. Where is it? Hegemony. Yes, this one right here. I wish that we could pass this out like they used to pass out, you know, samples in the mail. This one right here.
I have not read that.
This one right here. This should be like required reading. So this talks about the concept of. It talks about a lot of concepts, but Smucker was an occupier. Buy this book. Read this book. He talks about the concept of prefiguratism, and that means that prefiguratism is a concept where it basically skips over strategic politics and goes directly to people who say, this is what democracy looks like. They're being literal. They literally mean this is what they think democracy is, which in other words, as long as we get out into the streets and we have a bullhorn and we're shouting, which by the way, we should do that. They think that, oh, I'm doing something. I'm actually making the change. Smucker suggests that actually there, you know, in your theory of change, you need to think that through. How is the action I'm taking going to actually create power, legislative, political power? How is this directly, and if it is not going to directly target some of these lawmakers in Texas who are writing, well, let's get honest, these, you know, a lot of these right-wing corporate think tanks are writing the legislation. Like ALEC is writing legislation, right? So a lot of these guys don't write legislation. They just take legislation that's handed to them and they put their name on it. But without directly targeting specific lawmakers and making their lives uncomfortable, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did with Sunrise, just, you know, occupying Pelosi's office, for instance. If it is not directly making life uncomfortable for these people, it doesn't have a huge, because they're just like, oh, really? They're protesting? Let me go and what salad am I having today? Like, it doesn't affect their day. Like, you literally have to disrupt and make life difficult for policymakers directly, and and you know, by name. And there's a ton of tactics that you can use, like bird dogging. But without really thinking this through, if we're just going to mobilize and stand outside of a building and the corporate media isn't going to cover those actions, or at least the indie media isn't going to cover those actions, you better think about how is the action I'm doing going to really make an impact? How is it going to change hearts and minds? How is it going to directly impact policymakers to pressure them, right? Are we actually organizing big coalitions? Are we like, think about all of the people that mobilize for any of these big mobilizations. Imagine if that was a voting block. Just imagine, right? Like, all these people mobilized on what was it, November 10th, 2016, after people went, whoa, Donald Trump, what? And everybody took to the streets, but why didn't they vote? Mm-hmm. Now imagine if we were as highly organized as the fascist right. Imagine if or even the neoliberal corporate Democrats, highly organized, highly strategic.
Well, and highly resource fueled.
Yes, true.
Which back to the point I was making, you know, I mean, this is part of the issue we face on the left-wing media sphere. It's just, there isn't the same resources. And so what you end up with is, if you walk into a bookstore, like, you're going to see books that are like, you know, My Life by Bill Clinton, because that's where the money is. And I'm not saying that Bill Clinton shouldn't write an autobiography, but the information and the resources that are available to us are not reflective of how most people feel and how most people, like, actually the information that most people actually want. And back to your other point, Jay, like, I think, you know, if people take nothing away from, you know, organizing, it's, you're absolutely right. Like, nonviolence has to be intrinsic to how we relate to each other, which doesn't mean it's peace and flowers all the time. Like, on the contrary, like, but, you know, conservatives love to say, oh, the left has gone too far with call out culture. Jay, I think it's way more what you're saying, that anyone who lives in America has internalized a violent way of communicating and being in the world. And yes, that contributes to call out culture, but that contributes to any number of things.
Yeah, and I got to be really clear. What I am not talking about is, I'm not talking about like sort of policing BIPOC, you know, people, how they should be and how they should think to make things easier for white progressives. You know, the notion of paradigm is important, because white supremacy absolutely, and patriarchy and colonialism absolutely pervades, you know, progressive and leftist cultures as well. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that call-outs are happening. I think that changing paradigms is messy. I don't think it's a bad thing that white men now have to think a little harder about what they're thinking and saying,
and
the
course.
Consequences. So I don't think that's the biggest problem. And it's also, like, I think where it falls off is the black, you know, no pun intended, like the black and white thinking. It means like polarized thinking. It's either this, you're either good or you're bad.
Well,
there's no room for nuance. There's no room for nuance in asking questions.
Well, unfortunately, you know, I mean, the one of the issues that I'm sure we've all seen is, like, I wish that call out culture were leading to more, you know, people in marginalized communities having bigger platforms. But unfortunately, it feels like what it's doing is, it's like white people being like, I am the wokest white person. It's like,
yeah,
all
which
right,
is a
like,
cover. That's a fucking racket. It's
exactly.
a racket by being performatively woke.
Mm-hmm.
It sort of gives me cover to not actually self-examine. That's
Right.
why I talk about transformation. Actual individual transformation means I need to look at my own conditioning. You know, as a white man, like I have to look at how have I internalized these paradigms of patriarchy, misogyny, white supremacy, colonialism. It is in the drinking water. It is in the dominant culture we live in. Like so I have to look at that. I have to look at really closely, look at my own consciousness. How do I react if I see a black man in a hoodie? Right? Is my first reaction to shrink? You know, white women, do you clutch your purse when you're in a when you're in an elevator with a black man? Right? But the performative wokeness gives cover, even for, especially for a lot of liberals, to step over. You know, there was a guy in Central Park that was walking his bird watching or something, and got into it with a liberal Karen who basically was filmed saying, like, I'm going to call the cops, and you and I both know what that means.
Oh yeah, that was crazy.
Like the subtext was clear. We know what it means, and she absolutely consciously weaponized it. And you know, she's a liberal. So I think that individual transformation and it's not a brand new concept. The Hermes principles, by the way, if you're organizing an affinity group, that is a great thing to look at. The Hermes principles are a great thing. JEMEZ is a great thing to look at. It talks about the need for individual self-transformation. That's why I meditate, you know, do a lot of different these like woo-woo modalities. There's one thing though I wanted to touch on when you say we're not highly resourced. And I just want to there's a few stories that I talk about, like the people for Bernie Sanders. This is like started off with a handful of people, and they really didn't have many resources. Mm-hmm. But what they did was very effectively leverage people power. They launched an initiative called the 99 Events for the 99%, which became a lot of those, you know, groups for Bernie, like the insert group for Bernie, all across the country. You know, and that became the power that pushed Bernie to run. Like he would not have run without seeing the grassroots power behind it. There's another story about a group that a campaign I came on to at the end called Divest LA, where this group pushed city council in LA to divest $8 billion and change the laws. We actually changed the actual way LA evaluates the process of banks to get the city's business. No resources. A handful of millennials with almost no resources went straight up head to head against Wells Fargo and won. So I think we need to break the idea that just because because the man has the money and the man has all the, you know, the resources, we're never going to win. We need to smash that, because time and time again, history has shown a handful of committed citizens with the right strategy absolutely can. David can absolutely fell Goliath.
100%. And yeah, unfortunately that's a great closing now. Everybody keep your eye open for Jay's book, which will be up on our website very shortly. Jay, do you want to close out with anything else? How else can people get involved, support your writing, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, more than supporting my writing, I would recommend people on September 17th, go out and occupy. Even if it's just you and a handful of friends. And I know for a fact, act.tv is going to be live streaming the day. So on September 17th and 18th, go out into your city hall, get 10 friends together, get a banner, and that's enough. It's enough. And if you're in LA, if you're in Boston, if you're in New York, I think Philly is having something, you know, like join us, you know, September 17th, there's tons of, we put a link tree together that we're putting together a website right now for that day, but go out and occupy, tune into act.tv on the day. And LA, we have a really cool coalition and show coming together. We have Pussy Riots playing, Not Too Bad. So we have an incredible, you know, coalition coming together. of anti-militarism, of health justice, of racial justice groups, and climate justice is very central. And I just, come join us. City Hall, downtown City Hall. There's going to be a general assembly at 6 p.m. on Friday, the 17th. The rally is going to start around noon at City Hall in the South Steps. Come out and join us.
I'm very, very, very excited about this. And yes, it will be live streamed, but Jay's right. You should go out and join IRL. And if not, we'll be live streaming.
and there, if you do go on and log on to the website, I did put it, there is a chapter you can download for free that has a whole, it's actually in a previous iteration of the book, but there's still an old chapter from the old book that's just a whole list of direct action tactics. And so it's just a whole big list of ways that you can make good trouble. So that's there for free. But mainly just, get involved, get out from behind the computer.
That's awesome. All right. Thank you so much for being here, Jay. Hopefully we do this again very soon. This was a blast.
Thanks,
and
Jocelyn.
We'll talk to you guys later.
Okay. Bye.